June 1948. The month is a hinge in European history, 3 years after 1945, as the Berlin Blockade hardened the continent's dividing lines. My grandparents closed a life they had known and carried into exile a small set of things and intentions. They left with garments folded against fear, a passport or two, a handful of coins, a bundle of papers, and folded into the margins of ordinary life, a set of practical instructions. That suitcase, at once urgent and unremarkable, was the first public act of a private ethic: preserve options so that dignity might survive displacement. For much of my life, I thought of that suitcase simply as the last object they touched. In 2013, at a small community archive exhibition, it was placed under glass and became a portable history. The straps, softened by use, a ledger, a tin of buttons, a faded photograph of a child staring into the camera, the objects gave off a quiet argument about what survival requires. Listening stations played my grandmother humming a lullaby and my grandfather speaking in a tone that mixed apology and defiance. Their voices were spare, lined with fatigue and tenderness. Visitors stopped and sometimes wept. The exhibit translated the private into the collective and, in doing so, reframed the legal and policy work I had spent a career drafting. Before 2013, I loved law as an intellectual craft, the clarity of a clause, the elegance of precedent. I specialized in eldercare planning and intergenerational transfers during the late 1990s and early 2000s, naming trustees, defining contingencies, mapping assets to intentions. These were technical tasks undertaken in a wider climate already altered by the 2008 financial crisis and early 2010s austerity politics, which had sharpened anxieties about security and public provision. By 2013, the exhibition changed how I read instruments I had once treated as neutral. Trusts and wills, I began to see, could be crafted not merely to protect assets or reduce taxes, but to preserve a self across time and to keep open the space for impulsive, dignified choices. The shift from instrument to care took place between roughly 2013 and 2018. Organizations once seeking technical legal advice began to ask ethical questions: how to structure supports that enable autonomy rather than corral people into dependency, how to craft eldercare that preserves continuity of identity rather than erasing agency. In conference halls and community centers, I learned to translate. Documents provide structure, but they cannot wash dishes at 3 a.m. or sit with someone who cannot remember a granddaughter's name. Legal tools must recognize frailty and the messy, unpredictable ways families behave. Those abstractions turned practical at home. In the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, my parents and I put explicit agreements in place to secure their agency as they aged. We crafted trusts, named independent trustees, and stipulated oversight mechanisms, standard practices for a cautious family. But life kept asserting itself in small, stubborn ways. A winter evening call asking for a piano lesson or a short trip taught me to meet desire with deliberation rather than default denial. The documents we had written were frameworks for considered generosity, not instruments to freeze possibility. Agency requires room to be impulsive without becoming irresponsible. I began to write into wills and trusts provisions resembling the practical devices my grandparents had used, small habits of care sewn into documents. Their efforts were less about rigid commands than about making future choice possible. My own estate plan designated funds for education and health crises I did not want decided by moral panic. It set aside money for mentorship teaching practical life skills: how to read a lease, balance a budget, negotiate with a landlord. The aim was not to prescribe a life, but to make certain lives possible. Loss came quietly. My parents died close in time in the early 2010s. The memorials were luminous in their ordinariness. A simple gathering in the bakery's back room where trays still smelled of yeast, tables covered in brown paper, notes and recipes written on tear-off slips. People spoke of small mercies: a father learning to ask for help, a mother returning to classes and finding laughter, neighbors bringing soup. The fund we had created paid for their burial and a scholarship in their names for promising young bakers who lacked means to buy tools. The bakery was where dignity often showed itself without words. The woman who scrubbed counters so her daughters could go to school, the apprentice learning precision in flour and water. After the funerals came inventory, the intimate archaeology of drawers and boxes. One evening in 2012, sitting in my mother's apartment, I found a folded recipe card tucked into a book of sonnets. It instructed a simple loaf that rose with patience and tasted better the next day. I baked that bread that night. It burned a little at the edges, but brought comfort in a way policy papers rarely did. The recipe card encoded an ethic: fold, rest, wait. That tension, generosity that empowers versus generosity that enslaves, became the lens for many later decisions. Then, on a small cold day in December 2014, an envelope arrived from a law firm representing the grandchildren of a cousin who had once stepped away from our mediation table. The letter alleged an improper diversion of family assets and called for an accounting and possible redistribution of the trust my parents had executed. On its face, it was clinical, invoking equity and statutes. Beneath that language lay an older ledger of grievances: doors closed, help withheld, nights when small households had to choose who would eat. The notice felt less like a legal demand than a summons to an argument we believed had been settled. Legally, the trust was robust: redundancies, clear expressions of intent, witness statements, mediator notes, an independent trustee, and provisions limiting conservatorship to specific services rather than wholesale surrender of agency. But litigation would be costly and corrosive, and could erode the projects the fund was meant to support: the scholarship, caregiver stipends, the archive exhibition. Private memories would be made public, and my parents' protective acts risked becoming forensic curiosity. The tools of law that had been intended to protect now threatened to become instruments of spectacle. I called the mediator whom we had trusted before. "You know what they want," she said, "but do you know why they want it?" The question became counsel. The grandchildren's grievances were real: debts, missed opportunities, lingering poverty. Their claims contained truth. I remembered my parents' care and the recipe card's instruction to preserve options. I could have adopted a terse legal posture, moved to dismiss and lock the door. That course would have been legally principled but narrow in compassion. I thought of the bakery smell, of the neighbor preserving jars of marmalade, and of how law can be armor, but armor needs oiling with humanity. So I invited dialogue. We met not in a courtroom but in the bakery's neutral room in February, after the December letter, a place where food could be shared and conversation kept practical. The cousin arrived with his adult children, a daughter who worked late shifts, a son who once cleaned ovens. They presented photographs and stories of scarcity, a parent laboring until hands were sore and still facing eviction, schoolbooks that were luxuries, debts that had never been repaid. The cousin's daughter said, "We don't want to take your grandmother's recipe card. We need a chance for our children to make one." That request, access, not possession, felt precise and true. What followed was mediation at its best, translation of grief into proposals. I produced trustee reports, scholarship records, receipts for caregiver stipends, and named the people who had been paid to drive my parents to appointments and sit with them at night. Naming humanizes ledgers. I explained why I had sometimes resisted unconditional cash gifts, because unstructured giving can create dependency that erases agency, but I did not hold the trust's form as an immutable precedent. The trust could respond. We negotiated a reconfiguration, a modest lump sum to alleviate immediate debts, and a new channel within the scholarship program overseen jointly. Governance would include representatives from the cousin's family and the bakery community. Scholarship criteria would expand to fund rotating opportunity grants for apprentices' startup costs. A portion of the corpus would remain ring-fenced for eldercare and burial costs. My mother's explicit directives, that could be reallocated only by unanimous consent of an enlarged board. We added mediation-first dispute clauses, sunset evaluations for certain allocations, and an appeals committee for applicants who felt misassessed. The details were tedious and human, but they aimed at durability. We did not dissolve the trust. We loosened some contours and tightened others. We paid immediate debts, created an opportunity fund, and broadened governance. There were tiers and small repairs. Some friends scolded me for negotiating with what they called blackmail. Others warned against precedent. Months later, the cousin's son sent a photograph: a young apprentice grinning in a kitchen, flour on his shirt, a set of new knives at his hip, the knives bought with grant money. That image mattered more than a court victory. It testified that shared stewardship could produce real life chances: steady income, school continuation, payment of medical debt, a deposit for workspace. Incremental gains built an architecture of independence. The episode reframed inheritance for me. It is never merely an account balance. Inheritance is obligations, stories, deferred dreams, and nurtured ones. Preserving a legacy sometimes means listening to claims and letting them reshape governance without abandoning protections for the vulnerable. I could have defended singular ownership and won in court, but what would have been left was a less resilient community and fewer lives able to choose. After the settlement, the bakery exhibit was updated to include a plaque naming the scholarship and the new governance board. The archive recorded oral histories that incorporated the settlement into the narrative, documenting both regret and gratitude. The recipe card remained in my drawer, smudged precise. I trace its handwriting and feel the ethic it encodes: fold, rest, wait. Those lines are useful beyond baking. They are instructions for living with other people's wants. Over the next decade, the trust did its most important work not in courtrooms but through modest acts: mentorship that taught a teenager to manage a till, a small grant that bought knives for an apprentice who then opened a market stall named after the recipe card, a bursary that paid for certification. Trustees learned to write reports as narratives rather than anonymized ledgers. The scholarship board met regularly and reviewed applications with humility, inviting oral histories alongside paperwork. The bakery owner taught apprentices to manage budgets and talk to suppliers. Mentorship programs seeded practical life skills: registering a business, negotiating with suppliers, speaking candidly about capacity without surrendering dignity. These programs worked because governance included community voices. Local nonprofits and legal clinics saw value in standing boards. Donors became willing to fund governance training as well as services. Law students who interned with me drafted clause and process templates, bylaws, scholarship rubrics, appeals mechanisms, designed to discourage litigation by design. But there were setbacks. Some apprentices dropped out, selection criteria sometimes sparked disputes, trustees occasionally enforced narrow views of respectability. We revised criteria, trained the board in trauma-informed interviewing, and adjusted processes to reduce reliance on narrating suffering in tidy ways. Legal forms needed periodic evaluation. A clause that worked in one moment could calcify injustice in another. The suitcase continued to be a lodestone. School groups visited recordings of my grandparents' voices and linked the objects to civic literacy: how to draft a basic will, set up joint accounts without risking autonomy, and spot predatory lenders. People needed both stories and tools, an understanding of loss and practical knowledge to prevent future loss. An oral history recorded the cousin describing the lump sum moment: bills paid, a child enrolled in a baking course, a cushion that made choices possible. That testimony echoed my grandparents' original intent: preserve options, because options are how dignity persists. Professionally, I grew more committed to teaching the grammar of boundaries. In workshops from 2015 onward, I emphasized that generosity without structure can harm and protection without agency can be theft. There are moments when unconditional help is appropriate: sudden catastrophe, no foreseeable path to independence, and moments when structured assistance delivers long-term impact. Distinguishing those moments requires empathy, comparative judgment, and the courage to be unsettled by stories that defy ideals. The long arc of this story, June 1948, the late 1990s and early 2000s agreements my parents and I made, the 2008 crisis, the 2013 exhibition that reanimated the past, the December 2014 notice and the February mediation that followed, the settlement and work from 2015 onward, contains a through line: a commitment to options. Constructing options requires legal imagination and human empathy in equal measure. Statutes and clauses must be read in the context of kitchens and bakery counters, of nights when someone cannot remember a name and needs a friend to hold presents. Objects anchored the argument. The suitcase that began as a vessel of loss became an altar to choice. The ledger and the recipe card made legible the obligations that pass between generations. The recipe card's simple injunction, fold, rest, wait, became a curriculum: patience without passivity, structure without cruelty. When I teach, I ask students to draft clauses for an opportunity grant, while preserving an eldercare reserve, to imagine applicants who will rely on the grant, and to write appeals processes that do not require tidy trauma narratives. The exercises demand clear drafting and an ethic of listening. We learned to build institutions that flex. Trustees produced reports as narratives. Oral histories became part of applications. dispute resolution paths emphasized mediation-first approaches. These measures did not erase hardship or guarantee perfection, they created living structures that could respond. When new claims arose or trustees faced hard calls, the culture we fostered and the instruments we built were tested. The work of governance often felt mundane: board debates over receipts, trustees growing rigid, community members stretched thin serving in unpaid capacities. Yet the slow accretion of trust and shared language made possible processes that felt legally defensible and morally recognizable. There is a stubborn humility to the story, the recognition that a principled refusal to give can become cruelty, that protecting certain bequests sometimes requires reallocating others, that listening to claims can turn wounds into institutions that invite participation. We did not invent a formula, we adapted small rules my grandparents and neighbors had practiced in imperfect ways and formalized them to be more resilient. June 1948 remains, for me, both departure and intention. My grandparents packing preserved options in the face of dislocation. The sequence that followed, from my parents drafting in the late 20th century to the 2013 exhibition, the December 2014 notice, and the 2015 mediation, were responses to that first effort. What mattered across decades was not only what was put into a suitcase or a trust but the ethic behind those acts. Try to preserve choice, do not convert care into domination, build procedures that invite participation, listen. Fold, rest, wait. Be patient but firm. Apply heat not to burn but to form. Those lines guide how I draft clauses and convene boards, how I sit across from another human being and let their story shape the legal response. The work continues in every new meeting, every assurance that a grant will reach someone in need, and in every quiet conversation where we decide to trust a neighbor with a small chance. The suitcase was small, but the intentions packed inside it, practical, stubborn, humane, have unfolded across generations into a modest architecture of dignity. The years that followed the first settlement were not a neat denouement but a series of small reckonings that tested the instruments we had fashioned in 2015. The trust continued to operate, scholarship disbursements continued to reach apprentices, and the eldercare reserve provided the predictable, if modest, scaffolding for bills and nights when my mother could not remember the names of neighbors. Yet the external world intruded in ways none of us had fully anticipated. The global pandemic of 2020 closed classrooms and markets, interrupted apprenticeships that had depended on in-person kitchens, and forced trustees to think again about liquidity and emergency powers. The emergency grants we created in 2015, originally conceived for short-term gaps like deposits or a piece of equipment, became an essential tool for survival in 2020 and 2021. That usability bolstered the argument that flexible, governed funds could outmatch brittle bequests when crisis came. One consequence of the pandemic was that the eldercare reserve saw greater use than anticipated. Home care visits, medications, and unexpected hospitalizations siphoned funds. I kept careful records, not merely because disclosure had been a point of contention in the earlier dispute, but because telling the story of expenditures had itself proven to be trust-building. Trustees produced not only ledgers but narratives: the aide who had sat with my father the night before he died, the taxi receipts that brought my mother to the clinic, the invoice for oxygen delivered promptly after discharge. The archive of receipts read like a human map of need. Those documents were crucial when, in March 2019, my father died, when friends from the bakery came by and told stories about him, and when, in late 2021, my mother wrote a letter that would reopen the questions we thought settled. The letter was short and fierce. Dated December 14, 2021, it arrived with the same economy of language that had once made her a careful bookkeeper and later, an anxious steward. She asked for the return of accounts that she said had been lost to decisions made without her ongoing consent. She expressed fear that the corpus was shrinking, that the grants were being used by people who were not kin, and that she herself could be left without control in the months that remained. She asked the trustees to reconvene and to give back what is mine. The phrasing, "give back what is mine," was an old vocabulary of ownership that sat uneasily against the trust's governance design, which had deliberately limited unilateral revocability in order to protect deferred options for community members in a fragile market. Her letter set in motion the mediation first clause we had added in 2015. Trustees called counsel, and the board convened an emergency session in January 2022. We followed the procedure we had designed: a neutral mediator, representatives from the cousin's family, a member of the bakery community, an eldercare advocate, and my mother's attorney. The mediator's role was not simply to narrow the legal issues but to open space for the stories that had shaped the dispute. Her loneliness after my father's death, her worry about being forgotten, the way the recipe card sat in her drawer like a quiet accusation that what she valued had been diverted. In the mediation sessions of April 2022, the arguments crossed from law to memory. My mother insisted that many of the scholarships had gone to apprentices who were transients, people who would leave the neighborhood when better opportunities arose. The cousin's family argued that the trust's purpose was not to prevent mobility but to create options. Apprentices who traveled with skills still carried the ethos of the bakery into new communities. I found myself listening to both positions and remembering the suitcase motif, packed not to hoard but to allow mobility. The legal briefs, the receipts, and the oral histories all mattered, but the shape of grief and fear mattered more than any contract. The mediator proposed a series of steps rather than a single decree. First, an immediate modest increase in my mother's stipend to address present insecurity. Second, a commitment to publish more detailed, quarterly narrative reports to demystify expenditures. Third, a revision of outreach protocols so that scholarship recipients would be more likely to demonstrate a commitment to the local community through modest service requirements rather than immobility. We also agreed to test a new reverse matching program. Apprentices who planned to leave the neighborhood could still receive seed funding, but part of the grant would be matched with a local mentorship obligation that ensured some reciprocity. The trustees adopted these measures in June 2022. We did not, and could not lawfully, reconstruct the corpus into unilateral possession for my mother. The trust's form continued to restrict revocation without unanimous consent from the enlarged board. What we did, instead, was breathe new life into the modalities of governance. These measures did not end the ambivalence. In community meetings, some elders accused the board of betraying traditional values of kin-first loyalty. Younger members argued that the point of a trust was precisely to distribute risk beyond a single family. The board learned to sit with both criticisms. In late 2022, we began an experiment. We invited a rotating elder panel to review a small portion of opportunity grants, not to control the corpus but to advise on cultural match and long-term commitment. That panel was not a fetter on the board's powers. It was a public ritual that signaled the continuity of values. When an apprentice from 2017 returned to open a stall in 2023 and painted the stall with my grandparents' initials, the elder panel's intuition had been affirmed in public. Meanwhile, the pandemic had shown the limits of in-person instruction, so in 2021 and 2022 we piloted virtual pedagogies. A grant funded a modest online course on basics, food safety, ledger keeping, supplier negotiation, that reached learners who could not be in the kitchen during daytime shifts. We learned that the grammar of boundaries mattered as much online as in person. Tests, mentorship check-ins, and simple competency demonstrations guarded against the very unstructured giving I had earlier warned against. These practical measures also lessened friction at board meetings. When applications included demonstrable skills and budgets, it was harder to reduce candidates to mere narratives of suffering. The most fraught conversation returned, stubbornly, to the ritual of inheritance itself. In 2023, a nephew of my mother, unconnected to the contested cousin line but close in proximity, argued publicly that the trust's governance had created an empire of moral claims that effectively excluded direct descendants from wielding agency. His contention was less about law than about the psychology of loss. Families sometimes want the right to reclaim legacies as a way of performing love and control. The critique landed in a year marked by broader anxiety about intergenerational transfers. Housing markets had grown volatile again, and the rhetoric of scarcity found friends in unexpected places. We responded by teaching. In community forums during 2023 and 2024, I laid out scenarios. When does a trust protect options and when does it calcify inequity? I showed examples of dispute resolution clauses that had avoided court and ones that had not. I walked through the decisions we'd made in 2015 and the changes we imposed in 2022, not to vindicate my own choices but to show how legal forms can be instruments of humility. The more transparent we were about process, the less often the rhetoric of "take it back" served as the sole language of grief. The technical adjustments continued. In late 2023 we amended bylaws to require a simple aging review of the eldercare reserve every 3 years, with a community hearing attached. That provision honored my mother's fear of being forgotten while preserving the trust's core purpose. We also strengthened conflict of interest rules for trustees and added an ombudsperson role to assist applicants who felt sidelined. These were small, bureaucratic reforms, and they had the effect of slowing escalation. The trust's corpus remained intact. The scholarship board expanded to include 2 apprentices who had completed 3 years of practice, and the eldercare reserve continued to be ring-fenced for burial and care costs, as my mother had originally insisted. The rhetorical insistence that they want my inheritance back is a useful condensation of a deeper human drama. Often what people ask for is not simply money but recognition that their sacrifices were accounted for, that the moral ledger tips in their favor. That insight shifted how we structured outreach. Applications now invited family narratives alongside professional biographies, and the appeals process required not only documentary proof of need but a discussion of how a grant would align with long-term plans. We discouraged grant dependence by stipulating time-bound supports and matched mentorships designed to build capacity. By 2024, the program's indicators showed modest successes and stubborn gaps. Apprenticeship completion rates had recovered from the pandemic shock. A small cohort who received grants between 2016 and 2019 had opened 3 new food-related microenterprises by 2023. The eldercare reserve had paid for a residence for my mother in the spring of 2024 when she moved into assisted living after a stroke. The move was expensive, and the board approved the expenditure unanimously, a moment of sorrow sweetened with collective responsibility. At her bedside that summer, she and I spoke in halting sentences about legacy. She returned to the recipe card and said, not as an instruction but as an admission, I wanted to hold it all. I replied clumsily that we had been trying instead to hold enough for as many as we could. She understood both claims. She had always been an ambidextrous person in moral decisions, capable of ferocity and surprising generosity. Yet the trust's evolution did not end the public debates. A local paper ran an op-ed in October 2024 questioning whether community funds administered by private trustees should be accountable to municipal oversight. A city council member asked for a briefing. The trustees prepared materials, showing the audits, the mediation outcomes, and a set of oral histories that included the cousin's testimony about life changed because of a grant. The hearing was not a legal cliff so much as a civic pedagogy about what counts as public good when private law governs distribution. We learned that doing governance in the open, publishing narratives, hosting hearings, made us vulnerable but ultimately more legitimate. Through 2025, the trust remained active and contested in equal measure. New applications came from younger people who had never known the pre-2013 exhibition, but who understood the bakery as a local brand worth inheriting. A handful of apprentices demonstrated entrepreneurial humility. One who had received a matching grant used it to co-invest in a communal oven for a cooperative in 2025, citing a sense of reciprocity that the elder panel had insisted upon. Another recipient started a program teaching basic budgeting to high schoolers. The lessons accumulated, not as axioms but as practices. Make processes visible, provide options rather than paternal solutions, build appeal mechanisms that do not shame vulnerability into performance, and always remember that money touches memory. The suitcase, always the image at the heart of the story, remained a teaching tool. My students would sometimes ask whether a trust could ever be final. I replied that legal instruments are rarely final because human lives keep changing. People die, illness arrives, markets shift, and politics recalibrate scarcity. The rightful aim of any instrument is not stasis but responsiveness, and responsiveness requires humility. I do not pretend that our adjustments cured the deeper social ailments that produce scarcity and the impulse to reclaim what one imagines as owed. What they did was create a latticework of legal, social, and narrative practices that reduced the need to litigate every grievance. Mediation-first clauses, elder panels, published narratives, and matched grants are not moral scaffolds that replace hard choices. They are mechanisms that surface them, invite broader participation, and make transparent the trade-offs that elders and heirs must weigh. In late 2025, as I prepared a new workshop curriculum that incorporated case studies from the Trust's decade-long life, I felt less like an advocate who had won and more like a steward of imperfect tools. The story kept moving, and the next chapters would require the same habits that had guided us since June 1948. Fold, rest, wait, apply heat carefully, preserve options where possible and listen when the living ask to be heard. Since June 1948, fold, rest, wait, apply heat carefully, preserve options where possible and listen when the living ask to be heard. Those instructions had been both kitchen shorthand and legal metaphor for decades, passed down as a family's special lexicon. They came from my grandmother's first ledger. She had dated the entry June 1948, the year she bought the oven that would feed a neighborhood for 3 generations. I had grown up with the ledger on a high shelf, the Inca map of how a family learned to turn flour and labor into a modest security. I also grew up with another memory, one less ceremonious but no less consequential. The night my parents wrapped my small life into a single battered suitcase and set me on a plane at Christmas Eve. It was the late 1980s. I remember the exact light in the kitchen, the way my mother's hands trembled as she tied the leather strap, how my father watched the clock as if time were a negotiable commodity. They were not cruel, they were urgent. Work in that part of town had dried up in waves, and the best hope they could imagine for me lay beyond the ocean. Go, my father said once, and then again, because saying once wasn't enough. The suitcase was everything I owned. I took it to a distant city where I went to school, found odd jobs, and slowly learned a language and its paperwork. I learned the difference between being legally present and having a voice in the contractual arrangements that shape people's lives. I learned to read trustee reports not out of curiosity but out of necessity, because the terms of other people's security felt like a lesson in how to protect one's own. Those 2 images, the ledger and the suitcase, converged in my work in the 2010s. The trust we formed in 2013 had been a communal attempt to transform lineage into a lattice of opportunity. Its architects wanted to keep the bakery's moral capital in the neighborhood while also acknowledging that opportunity sometimes means leaving. That duality was never tidy. If anything, the years between 2015 and 2025 taught me that the legal apparatus of a trust can both mediate and exacerbate family feeling. It can provide predictability and make claims legible. It can also harden grief into demands like take it back. In January 2026, my mother died. Her passing was not sudden. It had been the culmination of a slow unthreading that began with the stroke in 2024. The assisted living facility where she had spent her last months smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm bread. Some nurse had discovered the old ledger and had propped it on her bedside table. At the funeral, the ledger lay open beside her, a physical witness to the long project she'd set in motion decades before. People came who had been apprentices and neighbors and cousins who had never seen the inside of the kitchen but could recite menu items by heart. They spoke of the meals and the advice and of a woman whose hands could negotiate both a debt and a recipe with equal precision. They also spoke, sometimes with sharpness, of what they thought had been promised and what, in practice, had been distributed. Within 3 weeks of the burial, a letter arrived from an attorney representing my father's side of the family. It was briefer than I expected and more formal than grief. The letter alleged that the trust had been created under the influence of undue familial persuasion, and that, in any event, my parents had been under financial pressure when they made decisions about the trust's terms. They asked, politely but insistently, to open a dialogue about returning funds that, they argued, should have remained within immediate descendants. The demand had a kind of arithmetic to it, precise sums, account numbers, hypothetical distributions that treated people as columns on a balance sheet. I reread it in the kitchen where I had once learned to fold dough, feeling the ledger's paper under my hand as if proof and memory might weigh the same. I had expected a challenge eventually. Disputes had been a running motif in the trust's life since 2013. The cousin who thought history entitled him to a greater share, the nephew who argued the trust had turned into a moral empire, the op-eds questioning private accountability. What surprised me was the emotional tenor. The request to take it back was often less about dollars than about the ritual of control. People pressed for the right to do what the law had already denied because legal prohibition could not, by itself, salve the ache of being excluded from decision-making. That ache had been mine once too. The suitcase had been exile and hope in equal measure, but I came to see that those who wanted the estate back were making a performative claim. By possessively naming the legacy, they were asking to be seen as proper heirs. We responded as we always had, with process. On February 18, 2026, the board voted to invite mediation. The trust's bylaws allowed for mediation-first resolution, and they required that any challenge to the corpus be presented to an ombudsperson before public filings. We convened in a room that smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner and seated the elder panel at one end, the family's attorney at the other, and a mediator in the center. The mediator opened by asking everyone to name what they feared losing. That question revealed the fault lines. The father's siblings feared the erasure of a life they had invested in. The apprentices feared the loss of a small fund that, if redirected, might undercut the fledgling businesses many had just opened. The elder panel feared a precedent that would make the trust easy to unravel. And I feared that, in trying to defend an instrument, we might forfeit the relational work that made it legitimate. Mediation did not produce immediate reconciliation. It did, however, produce an inventory of harms and a set of experiments. First, we agreed to commission an independent forensic accounting of the trust's formation and of expenditures since 2013. The report, published in June 2026, confirmed that the trust had been funded in a manner consistent with the documents on file and that the eldercare reserve had been used for the expressed purposes. It also revealed an ambiguity in one line of the 2013 instrument, an ambiguous clause that, while not dispositive, had created room for the "they want my inheritance back" rhetoric. Second, we accepted a community-led truth process, a series of public hearings in July and August where family histories were told aloud and documented for the public record. Those hearings were raw. At one, a cousin cried as she recounted losing her job in 2012 and watching assets drift away into legalese she did not understand. Another speaker, an apprentice who opened a stall in 2023, described the psychological lift a small grant had given his family. The hearings were not an audit of hearts, they were a slower kind of justice that refused to let claims be reduced to ledger entries. The forensic report and the hearings did not end the litigation. In September 2026, the siblings filed suit, alleging that my mother had lacked capacity in the final years and that certain transfers should be set aside. The complaint was particular in its legal strategy. It did not seek to collapse the entire trust, which would have been an outlandish remedy, but to recover specific allocations that, they contended, had been improperly diverted. The local press covered the filing as if it were a morality tale about family and money. Town hall calls rose. Some donors wondered whether their names might be associated with contentious litigation. I insisted that we pull every lever short of court. We expanded the ombudsperson's remit to include restorative meetings, offered to fund an independent family counselor, and proposed a temporary interstitial fund that could be used to address demonstrable personal hardships without touching the corpus. These were not mere palliatives, they were attempts to translate moral claims into administrable remedies. In December 2026, the plaintiffs agreed to an interim settlement. The trust would create a family recognition fund equal to 2% of annual disbursements for 3 years, to be administered by a subcommittee that included a family representative chosen by lot. The plaintiffs held a public press conference to call it a partial victory. Some community members saw it as a concession that preserved the corpus, others as a symbolic minimum. The court case, however, continued on the narrower point of capacity and the alleged undue influence surrounding a 2015 amendment. That phase of the litigation required expert testimony, depositions, and a slow unraveling of memory. We produced medical records, notarizations from 2014 and 2015, and affidavits from trustees who recalled lengthy deliberations. The plaintiffs produced an anxious repertory of compulsions and regrets. In March 2027, the judge issued a bench ruling. There was insufficient proof to set aside the contested amendments. The ruling was not dazzling. It affirmed, in the language of law, that the trust structure had been respected. It also chastised the trustees, indirectly, for failing to maintain better contemporaneous notes that might have rendered the social process legible enough to prevent litigation. The judge's opinion urged transparency and the inclusion of family voices as a matter of good faith practice. The ruling did not make the emotional work vanish. In the months that followed, family relationships were prickly. A brother who had signed the 2013 instrument withdrew for a year, attending no meetings. At a particularly tense board session in September 2027, someone yelled that the trust had become an instrument of strangers, which is the rhetorical move that converts policy disputes into moral indictments. We pushed back not by arguing legalities but by inviting gestures of recognition, a naming of an apprentice bench in the bakery for a year, a recipe card memorializing the parents' arrival in 1948 with an annotation about the suitcase, a modest scholarship in the siblings' names for vocational training. These were small, non-fungible gestures, intangible enough to resist commodification but tangible enough to be public. Those gestures mattered. By 2028, the Trust added 3 structural reforms that were direct descendants of the litigation's lessons. First, we adopted a rolling 9-year audit cycle with public summaries written in lay language. The first of those, released in April 2028, became required reading in community centers. Second, we codified a family participation clause that guaranteed a seat, rotational and non-voting, to a family member selected by lot for 2-year terms, provided they agreed to a code of conduct. Third, we funded a community archivist to keep oral histories and curatorial evidence of decision-making. These reforms did not silence critics, and some accused us of placation. Yet the reforms also reduced the number of formal challenges through 2029 and changed the texture of complaints. People who had formerly called to demand money now called to request public recognition or to propose small projects. My own relationship with my parents' memory shifted in those years. The suitcase had once felt like a wound. By 2029 it was an artifact in the archive, its strap frayed, its leather browned, and a small label sewn inside with the date of my departure. People who came through the archive would finger the tag as if to feel the materiality of an exile that had produced, in time, a back and forth of duty and dissent. I learned that acknowledgement, listening, naming, a modest portion set aside for a memorial, could be a currency that bought some peace without rewriting legal reality. At the same time, we did not retreat from legal rigor. The board, chastened by the experience, approved in November 2028 a suite of protective clauses, an arbitration clause for disputes below a certain monetary threshold, clearer capacity assessment protocols for any future amendment, and an explicit clause tying the eldercare reserve to objective medical need assessments every 3 years. We also strengthened beneficiary education. Every recipient of a grant was now offered a short briefing on what the Trust could and could not do, and an invitation to a 6-month mentorship program. These measures were mundane but effective. By 2030 the frequency of formal grievances had fallen, and the tenor of public hearings had shifted from accusation to proposition. Wider forces continued to shape the work. In 2029 the city introduced new regulations for charitable trusts operating in neighborhoods with concentrated poverty, requiring more rigorous audits for organizations receiving municipal support. The Trust cooperated, providing its already public summaries and oral histories. A municipal partnership emerged in 2030. The city agreed to host a once-a-year public symposium on intergenerational funds and community economies, modeled in part on our hearings. That partnership carried its own risks. Municipal visibility invites political calculation, but it also turned the Trust's difficulties into a field of civic learning. We were no longer only menders of a family's incomplete promises. We were contributors to a small, messy repertory of practices that other groups consulted. Personal reconciliation with my relatives remained partial. The brother who had withdrawn returned to the bakery in 2031 for a public demonstration of an old dough technique. We stood in front of an oven that had not changed materially since June 1948, and he wept quietly as if the heat could anneal old fractures. The niece who had once called the Trust an empire of moral claims published a small cookbook in 2032 with recipes from apprentices and a foreword about the necessity of mobility and rootedness. The nephew who had argued about agency in 2023 ran for a local office in 2033 on a platform of community-led stewardship. None of these acts erased the lawsuits or the moments of estrangement, but each act extended an olive branch of sorts, practical, public, and imperfect. Throughout this period I returned, again and again, to my suitcase and the ledger. In lectures I gave in 2027 and 2030, I showed students a photograph of the suitcase beside the June 1948 page. The juxtaposition made them ask different questions. They asked how law can both secure and estrange, how people can design institutions that are resilient to grief, and how one might balance the desire to preserve a family's legacy with the necessity of making room for those who must or will leave. My answers were not axioms but case studies. I insisted on humility. Legal tools are instruments that must be maintained as conditions change, and humility is rarely a clause you can draft into an instrument. It is a habit you must cultivate in meetings and hearings and in the way you release or withhold access to funds. The claim that they want my inheritance back remained an evocative shorthand. It named fear, grief, entitlement, and the need for ritual recognition. But the long, often boring work of governance taught me that recognition can be manufactured without capitulation. Small acts, an oral history, a named bench, an archival suitcase, a family seat, did a disproportionate amount of cultural work. They acknowledged sacrifice and provided channels for grief to be heard. They did not eliminate the law's authority, nor did they pretend to. They made visible what the law alone could not quantify: love, loss, and the ongoing choreography of belonging. As the decade turned toward 2035, the trust continued to change incrementally. The apprentice who had once painted my grandparents' initials in 2023 opened a culinary school that year, with a sliding scale for tuition and a scholarship named after my mother. The elder panel continued to advise, sometimes in ways that frustrated trustees and sometimes in ways that prevented costly mistakes. New tensions would surely come. Money and memory keep producing them. But the work since the litigation had taught us to expect conflict as part of governance rather than as an aberration. We had developed a method: transparent audits, rotational family participation, mediation-first protocols, public hearings, and small symbolic reparations, that balanced law and ceremony. I kept teaching those methods because I had been, in a way, shipped out with one suitcase and had learned that safety is both legal and social. The story remained unfinished, because the lives that populated it remained unfinished. There would be more applications, more apprentices, more funerals, and, almost certainly, the occasional demand that something be returned. I had learned not to rush to deny the claim but to translate it. What precisely is being asked for? Money, recognition, control, and what can be offered that preserves the trust's purpose without effacing legitimate grief? That practice had no final flourish. It required patience, negotiation, and sometimes, the simple ritual of sitting together in a room and naming what was feared and what was hoped for. The ledger was still on the high shelf, the suitcase still in the archive, and in the plain light of a kitchen I continued to teach the same necessary lesson: institutions are not substitutes for love, but they can be instruments for living together when love alone is not enough. By 2036, the trust had acquired a rhythm. Meetings that once teetered between high drama and legal brinkmanship settled into an odd commerce of ritual and paperwork. The 9-year audit cycle continued to produce those April summaries that had become a neighborhood staple. In April 2036, the public summary included an appendix transcription of the 2014 notarization that had loomed so large in the litigation, and for the first time a trained oral historian annotated the trustee deliberations to explain why certain decisions, like the eldercare reserve, had been made in the language they were. That little scholarly tack invited more than compliments. A distant cousin who had not spoken to the family since 2024 wrote a letter asking for more access to the archive. The letter was received according to protocol: an acknowledgement within 3 business days, an offer to visit under the archivist's supervision, and a brief note pointing to the family participation clause that had been codified in 2028. It mattered, that clause. In June 2036, a family member selected by lot, an apprentice-turned-instructor who had served on a 2-year non-voting seat in 2029, attended a meeting and introduced a proposal for a youth apprenticeship exchange with a vocational school in another city. The trustees debated, not about legality but about fit. The apprentice's presence made the conversation different. She asked questions the trustees had not considered and insisted that any exchange include a reciprocal residency for visiting students to live for a month with families in the neighborhood. The proposal passed by a modest majority, and a small cohort arrived in 2037 from the partner city. The experiment was modest in scope, funded out of the fellowship pot that had been reduced only slightly in the 2035 budget, but its human consequences were visible. A young baker from the partner city stayed with the brother who had returned in 2031 and learned the dough technique he had demonstrated under heat the year before. Not all tests were gentle. In late 2037, a distant claimant, identified simply in filings as a collateral heir, sought to reopen an argument about distribution on grounds of mistake in the 2013 instrument. Counsel for the claimant argued that recent social science about familial intent should be considered. We relied on the 2028 arbitration clause for disputes below a certain monetary threshold and proposed mediation. The claimant insisted on court, and for a year the trust prepared a defensive posture. In 2038, a judge ruled that the arbitration provision applied and ordered mediation, underscoring the value of the procedural reform approved in November 2028. The mediation produced, finally, a settlement that was less about money and more about recognition. the claimant received a modest, one-time stipend and an invitation to submit an oral history. That resolution became an instructive case study in 2039 when the municipal office that had collaborated since 2030 asked the trust to present on alternatives to protracted probate litigation. Economic contexts altered priorities too. The recession that unfolded in 2040, visible in local reports by February, reduced donations and municipal support. Grants that had been steady in the late 2020s dipped in 2040 and 2041. The bakery's revenue stream, tied to foot traffic, contracted during those years. In March 2041, the trustees convened an emergency session to reassess the eldercare reserve and some discretionary fellowship funds. They relied on the objective medical need assessments that had been mandated every 3 years since November 2028, and the panel of geriatric advisors produced a prioritized list. The review forced hard arithmetic. The reserve would be temporarily augmented from the general fellowship pool for 2 years in order to ensure continuity of care for a set of long-term beneficiaries, and several smaller grants would be suspended. The decision created tension. Voices at the next public hearing in June 2041 called the adjustment necessary but painful. And it produced a flurry of letters from apprentices whose projects were deferred. We learned again that protocols can distribute scarcity without creating chaos, but not without leaving scars. That same year, 2041, the Trust's archive mounted a modest exhibition, from June 1948, Suitcases, Recipes and Transitions. The exhibit displayed the frayed suitcase beside the June 1948 ledger page and included a short film of the brother who had wept in 2031 recounting his first day at the oven. The exhibition ran for 6 weeks and traveled, by late 2042, to 2 community colleges. The city sponsored a public conversation in January 2042 that drew a new set of questions about migration, intergenerational property, and which memories institutions should hold. A local historian used the exhibit as a primary source in an undergraduate thesis that argued the Trust's reforms were a model for careful decommodification of family wealth. That phrase circulated in policy memos in 2043 and was cited in a national philanthropic newsletter in 2044. Calls and emails poured in from foundations and municipal officials asking for consulting sessions. The consulting work, and the attention it brought, introduced new political pressures. In 2043, a city council candidate referenced the Trust in campaign literature, arguing that the Trust's municipal partnership had allowed cozy arrangements between nonprofits and government. The candidate's critique misread the public symposiums that had begun in 2030. But the moment forced the trustees to formalize a firewall policy clarifying the parameters of municipal-hosted events and the Trust's independence. The policy, adopted in December 2043, prohibited the use of the Trust's name in campaign materials and required a public disclosure whenever a government official engaged with Trust activities in a capacity that might be construed as electoral. The clarification diffused an immediate clamor and preserved the municipal partnership's value as a platform for civic teaching. I continued to teach. In 2039 and again in 2042, I taught a brief seminar that traced the Trust's litigation and reforms. In 2044, a law journal published an essay I co-authored with the archivist that mapped the relationship between oral history and fiduciary practice. Students pressed me for prescriptive doctrines. They wanted a rule they could print on a pamphlet. I resisted absolutism. My argument, which had hardened into a set of practical claims by 2045, was that institutions require humility, protocol, and muscles of adaptation. Routine audits like the 9-year cycle teach discipline, family seats enfranchise those with a lived stake, mediation-first clauses reduce the trauma and cost of litigation, archives make intangible commitments legible. These points were not revolutionary, but they formed a template that other groups found useful. Family life evolved too. The niece whose cookbook had been published in 2032 continued to build a modest brand that tied recipes to apprenticeship narratives. In 2045 she launched a radio segment that recorded listeners' migration stories. The nephew who had run for office in 2033 won a council seat in 2046, and his municipal work emphasized small business support and vocational training, areas that intersected with the Trust's mission. Our interactions were sometimes awkward. He pushed for a city grant in 2047 that would have required us to alter our procurement procedures. We refused, citing independence and our firewall policy, and the refusal generated an argument that lasted over 2 months. We resolved it by crafting a memorandum of understanding that allowed for collaboration only on projects where the trust retained control over selection and disbursement. Compromise, again, proved the lubricant of governance. The apprentice who had painted my grandparents' initials in 2023 and opened a culinary school in 2035 continued to run an influential training program. In 2047 she sent 3 graduates to start a cooperative bakery in a different borough. The co-op paid apprentices a living wage and shared profits, and within 2 years its model was replicated in 2 other neighborhoods. The trust funded one of those seed grants, and the board's decision in November 2048 to support the co-op was emblematic of a larger willingness to fund experiments rather than foundations. The decision came with conditions: detailed reporting, a covenant to hire locally, and a 6-month mentorship attached to beneficiary education, which by then had been a required offering for any grantee. Disputes persisted. In 2049, a small group of beneficiaries alleged that the trust had drifted from its founders' original cultural commitments. They sought a non-binding interpretive declaration asking trustees to prioritize cultural programming. The trustees responded by commissioning a Founders' Intent Project, an oral history-driven interpretive essay that would be presented in late 2050 at the annual municipal symposium. The exercise was ceremonially useful. It did not change law, but it offered language that could reconcile competing interpretations of purpose. In January 2050 the panel presented an account that acknowledged migration, survival, and entrepreneurship as co-equal strands of the founders' legacy. The declaration did not satisfy everyone. Some argued for a narrower reading, but it reduced the intensity of the complaint, and for a time at least it channeled energy into programming rather than litigation. My own sense of inheritance shifted as well. By 2050 I had fewer fights left in me and more time for teaching, listening, and occasionally baking at the community table. The suitcase remained in the archive, and in 2051 the archivist proposed to conserve it using funds set aside in the 2028 reforms for material culture preservation. The conservation was technical: leather treatment, UV-filtered display case, an annotated tag sheet. When the batch of conservators returned the suitcase to the display in September 2051, they placed with it a small, laminated card that reproduced my mother's handwriting as a caption. She had written, in faint stroke, "Left with one suitcase." The card made the object more legible to new visitors born after 2000. Teenagers who toured the archive paused, read the line aloud, and asked where else such objects might survive. The gesture, a tiny, careful restoration, was a lesson in how physical artifacts mediate memory. Broader institutional replication followed. In 2052, a peer network of small trusts formed, meeting quarterly to share practices. The network's inaugural conference included presentations about the 9-year audit cycle and about the family participation clause. The conference produced a toolkit that circulated among municipal philanthropic officers. Some commentators praised the kit for its practicality. Others warned that procedural reforms can become ossified, capturing rigidity where flexibility is needed. The debate was healthy. By 2053 the toolkit was revised to emphasize continuous reflexivity, annual reviews of governance practices, not just 9-year audits, without rescinding the structural protections that had been hard-won in the late 2020s. Through this period, occasional claims surfaced that sounded very much like the old shorthand: "They want my inheritance back." And they served as prompts for the same process I had refined over the previous decades. When a niece in 2054 wrote an op-ed invoking that phrase to describe her sense of loss after a family member's funeral, the board invited her to the archive, provided an oral history interview opportunity, and offered a small grant to document recipes she said were disappearing from the family. She accepted. The narrative arc, claim, ritual recognition, small material concession, was not a universal remedy, but it worked often enough to be disciplined into a practice. As the 2050s moved on, I found myself less surprised by the recurrence of old patterns and more attentive to the ways institutional form can shape human feeling. The ledger was still on the high shelf, the suitcase still in the archive, the apprenticeship program continued to seed small projects. Lawsuits would come and go, some dismissed through arbitration, others resolved through mediation, and a few rare ones, taking the slow route to adjudication.